The ABSA Board has booted out Director Sipho Pityana with immediate effect. They cite a dereliction of duty on his part. This follows Pityana's decision to take the Prudential Authority, a wing of the Reserve Bank, to court, alleging that the PA had unlawfully conducted an informal process with ABSA, which led to the bank deciding against a plan to nominate him as the chair of the board. The Prudential Authority hit back, saying it had not argued him not to be the board chair, and that issue had never been raised with it, making Pityana's allegation false. ABSA says it gave Pityana an opportunity to respond, and based on his responses, they concluded that his conduct was a dereliction of duty and let him go. Now, in October, we got to learn that former Anglo Gold Ashanti chairperson and former president of Business Unity SA, Sipho Pityana, was taking the Prudential Authority to task for their handling and apparent blocking of his prospects in terms of chairing financial services giant ABSA. Yesterday, ABSA sent out a note to say Pityana has been removed from the ABSA board due to dereliction of his board responsibilities. Mr Pityana has distributed a 6-page response to his removal as director of the board of ABSA. He joins us now via Zoom to tell us what it says. A very good morning to you, Mr Pityana. Thank you so much for making the time.
Desiree, good morning to you and to your viewers.
This is an interesting turn of events. Did you fail to convince the ABSA board on the merits of your approach to the courts against the Prudential Authority? In your note, you mentioned a refusal to resign.
Well, I obviously took a very deliberate and considered view that it was up to the courts to decide whether the Prudential Authority had acted unlawfully or otherwise. And this is a provision that is allowed in terms of the Section 60 of the Banks Act for an affected party like me to challenge the Prudential Authority in this situation, where if they had followed the Section 60 in terms of the processing of the ABSA chairmanship. But of course they didn't. Of course, the Constitution also allows me to approach the courts in the event where I feel that my rights have been undermined. So the idea that the ABSA board could arrive at a decision that I, by virtue of challenging what I consider to be unlawful conduct on the part of the Prudential Authority, it constitutes dereliction of duty or negligence on my part, is quite preposterous. It's quite clear that this is corporate bullying. It's intended to intimidate me out of pursuing my rights with the courts, which I enjoy in the Constitution. And indeed, it is also intended to introduce a technicality in the case I have before the courts so that they can argue that it's academic. I'm no longer a director on the board and all of that. And I trust and I hope that the courts will see through that. There is no basis for anybody to argue dereliction. There is no basis for anybody to argue that I've been negligent in my duties as a director on the board of ABSA.
So based on what you say, you're going ahead with your court challenge?
Well, I'm going ahead with the court challenge against the Prudential Authority. As I have indicated, I saw that the Prudential Authority and ABSA have filed their responding affidavits. My lawyers are considering those. Certainly, there are some interesting dimensions in the statements that they've issued to the courts. One of them is an admission, in fact, that there was an informal process. They denied that it was prejudicial. I assert that it was. Interestingly, ABSA concurs with me that as a result of their conversation with the Prudential Authority, they came to a view that they could no longer proceed with my name. So it's quite clear that the conduct of the Prudential Authority, from my perspective at least, was prejudicial and was unlawful. But I'll leave that to the courts to decide. And indeed, the decision that was taken by the board yesterday is an unlawful one, and I will separately cause it to be reviewed by the courts as provided for in the Companies Act. You cannot remove a director on a board for exercising his responsibilities. It is my responsibility, by the way, as an independent non-executive director to exercise my faculties where I believe that there's something that is inappropriate, to take appropriate decision. When directors don't do that, you will have more and more of what we saw with corporate misgovernance in South Africa. That's why we're independent directors on boards. We're not employees of boards. When shareholders are not happy with us, then they remove us. But fellow directors can't take the step of removing a director for exercising his fiduciary responsibility. In my view, the court is capable of arriving at a decision that the Prudential Authority acted unlawfully. In that event, it would mean that, in fact, far from me having been derelict in my duty, the board of ABSA would possibly have been derelict in its duty and neglected to challenge the authority in encroaching on the role and responsibilities of the board. So I would have expected of the ABSA board to show regard and respect for our judiciary. After all, these matters are before the courts. Why rush? Why jump into a decision to remove me from the board instead of waiting for the court to deliberate on this matter, to consider the facts and arrive at a conclusion? What if the courts find that, in fact, my argument and my assertions are correct? They would have taken a punitive decision against me because I would have taken the ABSA board, the Reserve Bank to court. Why, Desiree, would it ever be right in this country that you can take the president of the country and challenge him in court for a cabinet reshuffle, and that you can challenge the president of the country for an unlawful conduct, and that you may not do so with regard to the Reserve Bank?
Yeah. What do you think of ABSA's concerns about their reputational damage?
I don't quite appreciate what that means, because the fact of the matter is that a bigger reputational damage to ABSA is to allow unlawful conduct by the Prudential Authority. Prudential authorities have got to act within the framework of the law. And if the board is of the view that, as I am, that the Prudential Authority has acted unlawfully, it is the responsibility of the board to challenge that. Banks and financial services institutions are custodians of deposits, investments, and money of ordinary members of the public. And it must be so that it is expectation of the public that in their conduct, banks and prudential authorities and Reserve Bank act within the framework of the law. When there is a demonstration of such disdain for the law, clearly all of us must be worried about the conduct and the governance of these institutions. That's where the reputational damage would come for ABSA. If the court make a finding that, in fact, my position is correct, it clearly must be so that the board would have acted in a way that seeks to undermine the law.
It's an interesting turn in your role in activism in the country, and of course we'll be watching events as they unfold.
Thank you very much.
Sipho Pityana there talking to us about ABSA's announcement that he has been fired from the financial services company's board, and we're also making attempts to get a hold of ABSA.